When people still believed that the darkness could whisper and the night wind carried curses, the question was not whether magic existed, but whose side the magic was on. A cow collapsed and died. A wheat field was shredded by hail. Children burned with fever at the edge of the village. And that night, the candle on the household altar guttered in a strange way. In small communities where every misfortune needed an explanation and every explanation needed a face, the figure of the witch emerged as an answer both terrifying and convenient. That was when the trial began, not only before a bench of judges, but first of all, inside the collective imagination. In the imagination and everyday life of old Europe, a witch was first and foremost a very real person. She might be a midwife who knew her herbs, a widow living apart, a milk seller who had tricks to keep cream from spoiling, and sometimes a folk healer with a few odd secrets. In many places, people drew a hazy line between the clever person who could help and the one who harmed by charms. But under the church's influence, the picture darkened. A witch was not merely a user of spells, but someone suspected of making a pact with the devil, defying the sacred order of the community. From there, two layers of meaning overlapped, one very ordinary tied to herbs, childbirth, illness, and harvests, and another theological, which cast the witch as Satan's servant. The image of the witch was therefore both concrete and symbolic. Concrete, because she stood right beside the most fragile moments of life, where a batch of butter that wouldn't set, a difficult delivery, or a strange sickness could all turn into suspicion. Symbolic, because she became the face on which a community could hang its fears. A birthmark was called the devil's mark. A black cat turned into an evil companion, and a pot of herbs became proof of sorcery. In the language of the time, people believed witches bore a mark upon their skin, kept tools like brooms and cauldrons, used flying ointment, had familiar animals as companions, and attended nocturnal gatherings imagined as mockeries of sacred rites. Thanks to sermons and popular woodcuts, these details formed a visual alphabet. Anyone who strayed from the common pattern could be fitted neatly into the mold. Seen as a social role, the witch was often someone without support in the village network. A woman living alone, a widow, a sharp tongue given to quarrels, a practitioner with knowledge beyond what most understood. Because they lived close to life and death, close to food and the seasons, they lived close to the fuse of suspicion. When the language of science was still lacking, the disruptions of weather, disease, and bad luck were bundled under a single memorable name. And from that moment, a witch was no longer only a person, but a ready-made story waiting for a face to fill in. Medieval Europe entered a long night of disease, war, and insecurity. Natural disasters grew harsher in the chill of the Little Ice Age. Trade expanded, but the gap between rich and poor widened. The church remained the soul of order, yet had to face reformation and counter-reformation. In such circumstances, descriptions of the devil and his accomplices were not mere children's tales, but a system for explaining the world. From scripture and doctrine to oral tradition and custom, people pieced together an invisible map. There, a widow living apart suddenly became suspect. A midwife with herbal knowledge, a woman hiding charms. A blunt man who quarreled with neighbors became kindling for an accusation. The power of that belief mixed with the power of a legal order, shifting from custom to inquisitorial procedure, and the witch trial became a tool of public order for an anxious society. Had there only been a vague fear, history might not have recorded so much blood. What organized fear into action was an intellectual and legal framework. From the late 15th century, collusion with the devil, pacts with Satan, and attendance at moonlit Sabbaths were systematized into a crime with its own internal logic. In German and Swiss-speaking regions, with their patchwork of jurisdictions, Tracts explaining heresy and how to hunt it spread the conviction that behind a spoiled batch of yogurt lay a supernatural plot. Ecclesiastical courts had influence, but it was local civil courts where the flames rose quickly. They held the power to interrogate, detain, and execute. In Scotland, in Lorraine in France, and in German prince-bishoprics such as Trier, Würzburg, or Bamberg, large-scale campaigns unfolded in waves, each wave sparked by a confession, and fed by lists of friends, relatives, and neighbors named in turn. In a society where swearing before God was the measure of truth, interrogations were not always haphazard, but the so-called method rested on a deep suspicion of the accused person's humanity. People believed the devil granted his servants the power to lie without blinking, so torture was needed to unlock the truth. They also believed a witch bore the devil's mark, a darkened spot that felt no pain when pricked, or that a witch's soul could not sink if thrown into water because water symbolized purity. Each method, however solemn with legal ritual, was in fact a disguised religious rite, presuming guilt before evidence appeared, and the words bent by pain became the bridge to the next person's name. From a sociological view, witch trials magnified everyday frictions. A European village was not only axes and fields, it also had loan contracts, disputes over common pastures, envy over dowries, tensions between young and old, and dislike for outsiders. A lost pig, butter that would not churn, a scrawny child, each could become the language for long-stored resentment to speak at last. She cursed me, and when that language was affirmed by church and court with theological labels, it became irrefutable to the victim. The danger of the witch in the imagination, therefore, did not necessarily lie in any supernatural act, but in the community's power to control the story. Once someone was believed to be a witch, every sign of witchcraft would be found upon them. One question returns again and again. Why were most victims women? The simplest answer is that people already believed women were morally weaker and more easily tempted by the devil. But behind that prejudice lay a social structure that placed women in risky positions. They were midwives, herbal healers, milk sellers, egg traders, childminders, occupations tied directly to birth, illness, and death. When life and death grew precarious under disease and hunger, the links nearest to livelihood and to the human body were those most easily suspected. In addition, customary law on inheritance, the role of widows, and the status of unmarried women left them socially isolated. Women made up the majority of the accused, but there were men too, especially in healing trades, as folk magicians, or simply because they were caught in a local web of grudges. The story of gender must therefore be read alongside the stories of power, property, and fear. These trials cannot be understood apart from their religious context. The Protestant Reformation shook spiritual and political order. The Counter-Reformation shored up discipline. Borderlands between the two systems of belief became places ready to see devils across the line. Theological debates about salvation, sacraments, and the authority of pope or presbyter, however lofty, filtered into daily life as simple accusations. A neighbor consorts with devils, someone profanes baptism, a child has been exchanged by malevolent spirits. When theologians wrote about demons as seriously as they wrote about law, and sermons mixed folk superstition with scholastic reasoning, the local courtroom suddenly held a full aesthetic of sin powerful enough to make anyone tremble. Yet a correction is due for the sake of historical fairness. Taken as a whole, the peak of witch hunting was not the murkiest darkness of the early Middle Ages, but the early modern period of the 16th and 17th centuries, when central states grew stronger, printing flourished, and legal institutions were modernizing. The more modernization cared about order, the larger the shadow of the disturber of order became. In much of Spain and Italy, centralized and professional religious bodies paradoxically contained outbreaks better, because they demanded strict procedure and skepticism toward baseless accusations. Meanwhile, In regions with fragmented jurisdictions, every small court had enough authority to turn rumor into sentence, one wave following another by inertia. If you examine a typical trial closely, you'll see a sequence at once familiar and strange. An accusation arises after a quarrel or an accident. Notables of the village are invited to testify about the accused's character. Authorities search for signs in the housepots, salves, drawings. The body of the accused becomes evidence. A birthmark, a mole, a callus is interpreted in the language of deviltry. Then comes the interrogation, leading questions about night gatherings, about a black cat, about foods with the taste of lard and the scent of resins. Day after day in custody, fear and the desire for an end bend the prisoner toward saying what both questioner and questioned have already heard too many times. Another name is spoken. The net swells. In the end, the sentence is pronounced as a ritual of communal purification, followed by the fire or the rope, with prayers sending off a soul believed to have sold itself, so that the rest might be at peace. To understand why a community believed the unbelievable, look to the economy of belief and information. Printed words and rumor coexisted. Anti-witch tracts became bestsellers, reinforcing the visual template of witchcraft from containers to rites. Woodcuts depicting the brutal revels of demons became a shared visual memory. And when enough people share the same imagined memory, it can overwrite the memory of reality. A kind midwife could turn into a masked shadow in a single harsh winter with 3 infants lost. On the other hand, local rulers sometimes exploited the fever to strengthen their authority, earning a few troublemakers, prove that law and order still worked in a turbulent age. Even so, history is also the story of awakening. As the 17th century moved into its latter half, skeptical voices grew. Jurists insisted on material evidence. Ministers and priests wearied of the vortex of gossip and confession. Scholars recognized that weather and disease could be explained without magic. Gradually, standards of proof tightened. Torture was restricted, and a lone confession no longer sufficed to destroy a person. Here and there, great cases were reviewed. Death sentences came fewer and farther between, not because Europeans suddenly became kinder, but because they found a better way to see the world, the way of reason, of science, of the rule of law. When society gained more secular mechanisms for healing, for restitution, for settling disputes, the need to use demons as a screen for misfortune diminished. Yet the lesson of the witch trials does not lie still in a museum case. Whenever a community is frightened, whenever disaster demands an instant explanation, whenever social media erects a straw figure onto whom a crowd can vent its rage, the memory of the old flames flickers again. Replace the wooden stakes with denunciatory posts, the tortured confessions with coerced apologies in a storm of public opinion, the devil's marks with collaged snippets of images and rumors, and we see the same psychosocial machinery, simplification, a final rationalization, and the belief that sacrificing someone will restore order. History, in that sense, does not repeat detail for detail, but repeats the pattern. In the end, every generation has its own witches. They may be a suspected minority, a new science that is feared, a hated ideology, or simply those who do not fit the rhythm of the majority. When uncertainty rises and fear seeks a face to grasp, the pointed hat is placed on someone's head again, even though they are just an ordinary person with the same faults and hopes as the rest of us. The lesson, therefore, is not to deny the past and lull ourselves that we are more civilized now, but to learn to rein in the hunting instinct in the present. Demand evidence before judging, ask questions before condemning, and let reason move one step ahead of emotion. Remember that simplified stories are convenient, and that very convenience is often the shortcut to injustice. If there is a purification worth performing, it is the ritual of clarifying our language and imagination, naming fears accurately, identifying causes correctly, making room for difference, and letting law and science do their work. When we manage that, we no longer need witches to explain the chaos. Instead, we see the human being, and amid history's long winters, that is always the first step toward the light.